Everyone thinks déjà vu means you've been somewhere before, a past life, a forgotten dream, a glimpse of something you shouldn't be able to see. It's none of that. Déjà vu isn't your memory working, it's your memory failing and catching itself in the act. That eerie feeling is the sound of your brain running a diagnostic on itself, and what it finds is stranger than any past life. The word itself is French. It was coined in 1876 by a French philosopher named Émile Boirac, who had just experienced the sensation and had no idea what to call it. He chose déjà vu, already seen, but he knew that was just a description, not an explanation. He spent the rest of his life trying to find one. He never did. Most people assume déjà vu is some kind of glitch, a hiccup, something that happens when the mind slips. That's the closest to the truth, but it's also where the real mystery begins. Because scientists have spent over 100 years trying to figure out which part of your brain is glitching, and why it would do it at all. And what they've found isn't simple. It isn't even stable. The more they look, the stranger it gets. Let's start with timing, because timing is the part nobody talks about. The first person to study déjà vu with any rigor was a Harvard psychologist named Edwin G. Boring. In 1923, he published one of the first systematic surveys of the experience and made a strange observation. Déjà vu, he wrote, almost never happens when you're alone. It almost never happens when you're reading. It almost never happens when you're focused on one task. It happens in crowds. It happens in conversation. It happens in moments of distraction, when your attention is split. Think about that. Boring's surveys were small, but the pattern kept appearing in every study that came after him. Déjà vu is not a memory phenomenon. It's a perception phenomenon. It doesn't come from a place you've been. It comes from a place you're in. Specifically, a state where your brain is doing two things at once and they momentarily disagree. In 1982, a cognitive scientist named Robert Efron proposed the first real neural model. He called it the dual process theory, and it was almost too simple to be plausible. Your brain processes visual information in two separate streams, he said. One is conscious and deliberate. The other is automatic and unconscious. They normally run in sync. But in a moment of fatigue, distraction, or novelty overload, the unconscious stream can fire a fraction of a second ahead of the conscious one. When the conscious stream catches up, the conscious stream thinks, I've already been here. Because neurologically, it kind of has. This wasn't proof, but it was the first time anyone had proposed a mechanism. And for decades, the mechanism felt close enough. Then in 2003, a team at the University of South Carolina made the model much more uncomfortable. They were scanning the brains of epileptic patients. These are people with severe, sometimes daily seizures. About a third of them reported experiencing déjà vu constantly. Not once a year, not once a month, but multiple times a day, sometimes in the middle of a sentence. The team, led by neurologist Hal Blumenfeld, used electrodes to map exactly which brain regions fired during these moments. They found a single consistent location, the rhinal cortex, a small ancient structure buried deep in your temporal lobe, right next to the hippocampus. The rhinal cortex is the part of your brain that flags the familiarity of what you're seeing, not the content, not the details, just the feeling of recognition. When you walk into a room and feel like you've been there before, the rhinal cortex is the thing producing that feeling, nothing else. These seizures were overstimulating that exact structure. The patients weren't remembering anything. Their familiarity circuit was being driven directly. Their brains were being forced to feel I have been here without any matching memory attached. That's why the feeling never resolved into an actual scene. There was nothing to resolve it into. But here's what's fascinating. If a circuit can be driven too hard, it can also be checked, and the brain appears to have a built-in monitor doing exactly that. In 2012, a team of neuroscientists in Paris, led by Catherine Talon-Baudry, ran an experiment that changed the field. They used EEG to record brain activity in healthy volunteers during genuine déjà vu moments, not seizures, just the ordinary kind you and I have every few months. The participants were trained to recognize the sensation and signal it with a button press the instant it happened. What Talon-Baudry found was unexpected. The déjà vu experience was preceded by a sharp drop in activity in the rhinal cortex. The familiarity circuit, the one Blumenfeld had identified, was going quiet before the feeling started, not firing, suppressing. Think about what that means. Your brain is not glitching in the way anyone assumed. It is checking itself. The familiarity signal is briefly suppressed, and in that brief window, the conscious mind registers the absence of recognition, as something that should be there, as something that was there a moment ago. Your brain is not failing to record the present. It is producing a phantom sense of the past to make sure the real system is still working. That's not a glitch, that's a diagnostic. But the story doesn't end there. Because if déjà vu is a diagnostic, then we should expect it to be louder in some brains than others, and it is. In 2006, a researcher at the University of Leeds, named Chris Moulin, began studying a small but remarkable group of people who experienced persistent déjà vu. Not the kind that comes and goes, the kind that never stops. Every conversation echoes, every meal has been eaten, every person has been met. Some of them stopped watching television. Some stopped reading the news. One man refused to see his doctor because he was certain he'd already been to the appointment. Moulin published a series of case studies, and a striking pattern emerged. Persistent déjà vu was almost always associated with either anxiety disorders or damage to the frontal lobes, the part of your brain responsible for reality monitoring. The part that says, this is a memory of something that actually happened. When that part of the brain underperforms, the familiarity signal runs unchecked. The diagnostic never finishes. The echo never stops. Moulin's patients were living inside a sensation the rest of us get a few times a year. For them, it had become a wall. So the simple model, the dual process theory, the seizure model, the diagnostic model, they're all pieces. They're all describing different angles of the same phenomenon. The familiarity circuit can fire when it shouldn't. It can be checked when it shouldn't. And when either system slips, your brain invents a past for a present that just arrived. But here's the part nobody talks about. The people who experience déjà vu the most aren't the people with the most memories. They're the people with the most attention. Every study that has ever been done points the same direction. Déjà vu is not what happens when your brain fails. It is what happens when your brain is overengaged, overstimulated, processing more input than it can comfortably sort. Crowds, conversations, travel, novel environments. Déjà vu is the sound your mind makes when it's working too hard, not too little. And it almost completely vanishes after 60. Not because the brain degrades, because the brain settles. The world gets smaller, the novelty goes down. The diagnostic stops firing because there's nothing left to check. This is what your mind does when it has too much present to handle. It briefly pretends the present is the past, so it can buy itself a moment to catch up. And if you really want to know what déjà vu is, that's it. It isn't proof of a hidden life. It isn't evidence of a parallel world. It is the sound of a very old, very careful machine realizing, in real time, that it has more happening around it than it can immediately absorb. The feeling is not a memory. It is the absence of one, performed at the exact moment your brain needs to know the difference. You feel it because you are paying attention to more than your mind can file in a single moment. That's not a bug. That's the cost of being conscious in a world that never stops being new. And your brain, for one brief, uncanny second, lets you know exactly how much it's holding.